I do want to acknowledge everybody that participated in this work, or almost everybody that participated in this work. Working with populations is not trivial, requires a lot of man hours, and I clearly didn't do my fair share. I'm just getting most of the credit, but I want to point out that most of this work was accomplished by a group of very eager and ambitious undergraduate students. Ruben and Jenna were two of the first undergraduate students that began working with me when I arrived in 2005. But April and Simone have been my colleagues working with me on these projects from the very beginning. And I want to acknowledge Jan and Anna Song for their contributions to helping us work through our project and reviewing our papers and so forth. That was very useful and helpful in the end. And the other thing I want to point out is the paucity of funding that we had. Great Valley Center gave us money to fund Jen and Ruben, but most of the work I'm going to present today was not the result of some very large NIH grant. We actually did this with about $5,000. So, you know, I wish we had more money. We could have probably done more. But at least it gave us some very robust preliminary data that we can move forward to try to secure some more significant funding. As I mentioned, some of this work has already been published, and so I'm going to speak quite a bit to most of the work that we've already published. But I point this out because these two publications were the product of the students. A handful of undergraduate students, as I mentioned, were responsible for a majority of the work that I'll present here and that's been already published. And I mention this because I want to emphasize the ability or capacity for undergraduates to accomplish some very profound research. And I know there's a good number of undergraduates here right now. You're probably here because you have to be or getting credit for it. But nonetheless, you're here, you're going to learn something. But understand that there's opportunities out there for you to get involved in research. And ultimately, we hope that that research leads to first author publications. And so, you know, when I was an undergraduate going through, didn't quite have these opportunities. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to provide these opportunities to the students that have been working with me. So for those of you involved in research, you know, carry on. Okay. This next set of slides are not unique. They're not mine. They're freely available to anybody at the CDC website, but they're very impactful. I think they resonate with the story that we're going to tell here today. And as I go through these slides, I want you to focus on two things: the date, or the year up here, and the change in colors, for those of you on this side. And notice that the darker the color gets, the more detrimental the condition gets, the more severe the condition gets. And so, you know, pick your favorite state, whichever, keep your eye on that state, and keep your eye on the year. So this slide here just summarizes what you just witnessed. I know we're in fall, and we're excited about that because the leaves are changing color, just like our state was changing, our country was changing colors. But it's nice when it's fall and it changes with the season, but our country's not supposed to change like the autumn cascade. This is really unfortunate. And in about 14 years, we've gone from a very nice cream of wheat color to a very unfortunate color of the aspen cave. And things don't seem to be getting much better. The CDC has been tracking obesity and diabetes prevalence rates even before 1958. But here's a nice figure that they've developed that shows you the diabetes, percent of diabetes or prevalence rates over the years from 1958. And when you look at this, you can begin to appreciate that not until recently did the slope of this line really begin to change dramatically. Okay? And so while this is diabetes, not obesity, and we're dealing with adult population and not adolescents, the idea is still the same. That it's been until recently when we've seen this very steep increase in the slope of the presentation of diabetes prevalence. Now, we're talking about obesity, not necessarily diabetes, but when we talk about the consequences of obesity, they're very profound. They're ubiquitous. They're found, it's found in virtually all pathologies that we know of. Okay, and for those males sitting in the room looking at this, yes, this is a female, but this could just very well be a male. And with respect to reproductive disorders, it's just as profound in males as it is in females. So don't think that we're getting off any easier. Something that this slide is missing that I think is really important is the neurodegenerative disorders that are associated with obesity prevalence, as well as a lot of mental and psychological disorders that go along with that as well. So while this figure is not exclusive or wholly inclusive, it does give a brief summary of all the pathological impacts that are associated with obesity. So let's turn our attention a little bit and start to focus on what do we know about obesity in adolescents. Okay, there's been quite a bit of work done in this area. We know that the prevalence of overweight and obesity among U.S. adolescents has increased for the past 2 decades. And Cynthia Ogden's review of the N. Haynes data from 2006, which was recently published, will show that there's actually a plateau in the prevalence of obesity, and so she goes on to suggest, well, not just her, but her and her co-authors go on to suggest that we've actually reached a plateau in the prevalence of obesity. Keep that in mind. Most of the data on adolescents stem from these large national surveys that don't discriminate between urban metropolitan areas and rural areas. Okay, that'll be an important point as we go forward. Most of the data has clearly showed that there's a disparity in the prevalence of adolescent obesity, impacting Hispanics and African Americans to a greater extent than non-Hispanic whites. There's strong evidence from Nancy Butte's group down in University of Houston, which shows that there's a very strong genetic contribution to the increased prevalence of childhood obesity. And that would suggest that essentially obesity isn't prejudice, that it'll impact any group the same way. And also there's an increased prevalence of obesity associated with an increased prevalence of hypertension in children and adolescents. And this follows the same MO as what we see with adults. Now, while that's all good and dandy, and this is really nice data that's been produced, it only provides a snapshot in time of what's actually going on. Very few studies have actually tracked adolescents into adulthood to see what the effects are with progression through life cycle. Up until recently, Penny Gordon-Larson's group down in North Carolina has recently showed in a group of adolescents that they were able to track for something in the range of about 15 to 20 years. And they showed that about 75% of severely obese teens remain so at the age of 30. Okay? That doesn't give a lot of hope for those severely obese teens. Only 1 to 2% of normal weight teens became severely obese by the time they were 30. So that's actually good news. Okay? Very few normal weight teens actually develop morbid obesity by the time they were 30. So this would suggest that normal weight teens will actually stay normal weight at least until the age of 30. Okay. But normal weight adolescents in this group anyway gained an average of 37 pounds between their teen years and the age of 30. The average height of this cohort was 5'7". Now, understanding that the body mass index calculation is a ratio of mass to height, you'll understand that these numbers will actually produce about a 4 to 6 BMI score point increase over this time. So what this is saying is that some normal weight teens actually became overweight, and some teens that were right on the border of being normal weight and overweight actually became morbidly obese. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into some of the large survey data studies that have been produced. And these are primarily the NHANES surveys. This is the National Health and Nutritional Examination surveys that have been going on since the 90s. And as I mentioned before, Cynthia Ogden and her group have shown that for the most part, this is essentially a summary of all the NHANES surveys since the 99-2000 survey, and they show that for the most part, the prevalence of overweight and obesity in this group of adolescents has plateaued. It's not going up. Okay, so that's good. However, one of the fallbacks of these large data sets, aside from the fact that they don't discriminate between community size, they also don't do a very good job at discriminating with age. And as a physiologist, I can tell you that the physiology of a 2-year-old is nothing like the physiology of a 19-year-old. And so these data are compiled and they don't discriminate with age. So it minimizes the impact and usefulness that we can use if we want to assess the developmental effects associated with the prevalence of obesity. Now, in the early 1990s, Pawson and his group did a very nice survey of prevalence of overweight and obesity in targeting specifically U.S. Hispanics. As best as I can tell in the literature, this is the first study, the first non-NHANES study that specifically target an ethnic or racial group, and in this case, Hispanics. And they conclude that obesity-linked diseases will assume a greater significance in areas that support large Hispanic populations and place a greater burden on public health resources and facilities that cater to the needs of minority and largely urban communities. The reason I bring this up is because Hispanic populations, Merced County is essentially 54% Hispanic. And this study focused on groups in urban communities, and we're not an urban community. So I bring this up because I want you to try to remember at least this part of this data as much as possible so we can compare it to ours as we go along. And the reason why is that this age group here resonates with the age group that we targeted in our study. The other thing that you can take from this study is When you look at the prevalence values, this is for Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans. This value here on top is for prevalence of overweight, and the value on the bottom is for prevalence of obesity. And for the most part, regardless of the group and the age, the prevalence of overweight is greater than it is for obesity. Now, as I mentioned, obesity has an impact on a number of different physiological functions. And the one that I'm more interested in, aside from insulin signaling, is blood pressure. Okay? And so there is very strong data in the literature that shows that there's an association with increased obesity and increased blood pressure. Increased blood pressure is a very important cardiovascular risk marker. And so it's not surprising that individuals with elevated blood pressure, when it's chronically elevated, referred to as hypertension, actually present more frequently with other cardiovascular complications later on in life. So at all costs, you want to minimize your blood pressure. So when we look at this data taken for Canadian children from rural areas, we can see that there's a strong association between obesity and the development of both pre-hypertension and hypertensive conditions. Now, I will refer to this as pre-elevated and elevated blood pressures because American Heart Association has a very strong, sentiment about using the term hypertension. And in these cases, when it's a single measurement, it's not diagnostic. And so the term hypertension refers to a diagnostic evaluation or assessment. And in this case, it's not. So I hope there aren't any spies from the American Heart Association here. But anyway, so we should more correctly refer to it as pre-elevated and elevated blood pressure. But nonetheless, the idea is still the same. You can see that obese rural Canadian adolescents and children have a greater risk for developing high blood pressure. Okay. This is really nice data, and this is the first data that I found that clearly shows this increased risk of weight with increased blood pressure. The problem here is that they don't have the power to discriminate boys and girls in the specific age group. So for age 4 to 12, this is a compilation of both males and females, as the same for the adolescents. And then when they break it up by gender, unfortunately, they don't have the power to look at it in terms of age within the gender. So again, this data is a little bit limiting in its usefulness and impactfulness in this regard, but nonetheless, it provides some of the seminal data that shows that increased body mass increases the risk for the development of increased blood pressure. Another area that we looked at was the impact of physical activity and what we refer to as screen behaviors in our population. And in this study here, surveying about 15,000 14 to 18-year-olds, primarily non-Hispanic whites, they tried to assess the impact of physical activity level and television watching on BMI. Unfortunately, when it came down to the real impactful data, these data here, again, they didn't have the sample size to discriminate based on ethnicity or race. And so, again, this is all males and females combined regardless of ethnicity and race. But there's some very good data here. There's very interesting trends. When we look at moderate versus rigorous physical activity, especially in females, you can see that the more rigorous physical activity, the greater the reduction in BMI. Okay? And then when we look at television watching, just the opposite. For both males and females, the number of hours in television watching goes up, your BMI goes up. Okay? Again, very impactful, but it doesn't discriminate based on ethnicity or race, and doesn't give us an idea if these behaviors are ubiquitous. That is, whether or not these behaviors are found in all groups. Okay. So with that, we wanted to try to gain a better understanding on some issues that remained unresolved. Are some of these discrepancies that we're seeing in the literature with respect to body mass existing in adolescents in a rural community? Again, as I mentioned, aside from the study with Canadian adolescents, and that's all good, but I'm really more concerned with adolescents in the US. Is there a similar trend? Most of the NHANES data, as I mentioned, is from these large urban populations. Also, we want to know if there are these discrepancies that exist with the association between the increased prevalence and obesity and high blood pressure in our rural adolescents. Some data would suggest that there's definitely, at least within children and adolescents, a strong association between body mass and elevated blood pressure. But with respect to Hispanics in a rural community, we just don't know. So with these questions in mind, we took to the streets with our very sophisticated methodologies and instrumentation. The ghastly tape measure, and a lot of people don't like those. Even less popular is the scale, all of which can be used to calculate body mass index. And then to measure blood pressure, very simply we used an automatic sphygmomanometer or cuff. This table here defines our study population. While we didn't target any group in particular, we just measured every student that consented to participate. You can see that a majority of our participants were Hispanic, with the next highest group being non-Hispanic whites, and to lesser degree African Americans. We actually got more Asian Americans, twice as many at least, Asian Americans than we did African Americans. Okay, so what did we find? Well, we found that there's a disproportionate prevalence of obesity within primarily males. And so when you look at this figure, the top figure here is for males, the bottom figure is females, and this is simply prevalence. The open bars is a normal weight, the gray bar, gray shading is overweight, and then the last bar is obese. These are the body mass categories that we use. And what you can see, and what was very striking and a unique finding, was that the prevalence of obesity was greater than the prevalence of overweight in our population, specifically with respect to males. We didn't see this trend in females, but this is the first time that we've seen this trend. What does it mean? I'm not exactly sure, but I don't think it's good. To me, it suggests that these kids are going straight from normal weight in early development into an obese category and skipping the overweight altogether. Okay. Now there's 5 points between normal weight, the definition of normal weight, and obese with respect to the BMI definition for adolescents, or excuse me, adults. Okay. So anything, a value of less than 25 is considered normal weight. 25 to 30 is overweight, and over 30 is obese, with CDC even defining that over 35 is morbid obesity. Now, what I think is happening is that these kids are going straight from that 25 number straight into the 30. Now that's not possible because you acquire body mass as you go along, but the idea is that they're not staying overweight for very long. When we looked at the relationship between body mass and blood pressure, what we see is here on your left, these two figures are the prevalence of pre-elevated and elevated blood pressures for males on the top and females on the bottom. And two things should be very striking to you when you look at this. One, the prevalence of elevated blood pressure, or what others have referred to as diagnostic hypertension, is much greater than the prevalence of pre-elevated or stage 1 hypertension in males. And then the other striking comparison is that the prevalence of both pre-elevated and elevated blood pressure is much greater in males than in females. Okay. Now, what is the impact of this disparity between males and females? Ironically, when we look at this figure here on the right, which identifies the risk ratios or odd ratios for development of these conditions, you can see that the impact is much greater in females. So this is pre-elevated blood pressure on the top and elevated blood pressure on the bottom, here and here. What we see is that with respect to pre-elevated blood pressure in females, the risk, if you're obese female, goes up about 4-fold. The risk goes up, it doubles, goes up to almost 8 for elevated blood pressure. 4 to 8. What this suggests that at least adolescent females in our community are much more susceptible to increases in blood pressure when they're associated with changes in body mass. In this case, the change in body mass is an increase. Now, we've shown this data recently, and actually it was on the BBC. Trevor pointed that out. It was publicized widely, and actually folks in the UK love this stuff. I've been told that they're actually going to publish it in some little magazine they have. But anyway, the idea is this data was widely publicized. And I actually got some, not negative, but some criticisms about this data, because there's people out there that do not believe that females are more susceptible to blood pressure changes than males, because when we look at the adult data, it's very well established that males succumb to cardiovascular complications much earlier in life than females, and to a greater extent than females. And that data from the Bogalusa heart study, and I'll show some of that in a little bit, shows that males are actually impacted to a greater extent than females. The data are what they are. I didn't make these up. Actually, I trust Simon with this data. He's the one that actually crunched these numbers, so I don't know if that was such a good idea, but his reputation's on the line as well, so I suspect that I'll trust him with this. But the idea is that, well, one, our data are what they are, and they're suggested that, at least in our population, females are much more susceptible to cardiovascular or mass-associated changes in blood pressure. That goes against the trend, but that's a good thing, because in science, I've heard it's not always bad to be controversial. In fact, that's how you get noticed. Anyway, so with that in mind, we wanted to take an additional step and better assess our previous data here with respect to the impact of ethnicity and race, because this data is just compiled for all groups. And as I said at the onset, that one of the major things that was lacking is discrimination in the data set with respect to ethnicity and race. So when we look at the relationship between body mass and systolic blood pressure prevalence, specifically in males, we looked at our 4 groups that we could identify. A is non-Hispanic whites, B, Hispanics, C, Asian Americans, and D, African Americans, excuse me. What we did is within each definition for body mass category, normal weight, overweight, and obese, as defined by age and gender charts produced by the CDC, we can see that as the prevalence of obesity, oh, excuse me, the other thing that's missing here that's not apparent is that white refers to normal weight, or getting this backwards. White refers to normotensive, gray refers to pre-elevated, and black refers to elevated blood pressure. So you can see that as body mass category increases, there's an increase in the prevalence of elevated blood pressure. Okay, and that's defined here. Now, we don't see this effect so much in the African Americans, and this is likely due to the small sample size. As I showed before, we only had about 144 participants in that group, and roughly half were male, half were female, so that's not a robust enough sample size to be able to make any definitive conclusions or show anything definitively. But at least with the other 3 groups where we had a little bit more, especially non-Hispanic whites and Hispanics, you can see a very clear trend with increasing body mass. You see an increased prevalence in elevated blood pressure. Now, when we look at the exact same measurements, but with females, you can see essentially the same trend, especially in non-Hispanic white females, as the body mass category increases, increase in the prevalence of elevated blood pressure. Interestingly, this impact was not nearly as robust in Hispanics or Asian Americans as the other group, as in the males. But if you recall, most of the data that had been presented to date suggested that there was very profound discrepancies or disparities with respect to ethnicity and the prevalence of overweight and blood pressure. And what we're showing here is that essentially it doesn't matter what color you are or where you come from. If you're a female, blood pressure, if you're an obese female especially, you're going to have elevated blood pressure. Okay, so when we look at this in terms of correlations, looking at stratification by blood pressure category, that is to say that we got within each group all the normotensive measurements, all the pre-elevated measurements, and then all of the elevated blood pressure measurements, and we got the means for the body mass index and their systolic blood pressure within that specific group and did these correlations. We came up with this with these relationships. And what's striking here is you can see that within Asian American females, they have the greatest slope. Okay. What this suggests is that in this group, they're a lot more sensitive to changes in body mass with respect to increased blood pressure. That is to say, a very small change in body mass in this group is associated with a greater increase in blood pressure. The one group that didn't look very good when we looked at the other data were the white females, and you can see ironically, they have the lowest slope, which would suggest that while the prevalence of elevated blood pressure in this group is highest, they're not susceptible to these changes. So some other factor besides body mass or increased body mass is contributing to their increased prevalence of blood pressure in at least the obese white females. That remains to be addressed, and I think a great topic for research. Now, that correlation is all fine and dandy, but there's another way to look at these relationships. What if we categorize these means based on body mass categories? We've shown that not all normal weight individuals are normal-tensive. You can be normal weight and still have elevated blood pressure. That is to say, you can be overweight and still have normal blood pressure. Okay? So we took an alternative approach and we categorized the means for body mass and systolic blood pressure by stratifying these groups based on their body mass. And so we got all the normal weight individuals from the different populations, and we calculated their mean body mass and systolic blood pressure and did these correlations. And what's very striking is that the slope of these regressions are very, very small compared to the slopes of these regressions. So this brings up a conundrum. What's the best way to correlate or associate the changes in body mass with the changes in blood pressure? So we've identified two statistically valid methods for doing this that produce very different data. So hopefully there's some good mathematicians in the audience that were willing to help us figure this out. But the idea, at least for our research team, is to figure out how we go about addressing this, because we've got to make a strong case to the research community on how to coordinate these measurements in a better fashion so that the measurements from here on out become more uniform and can translate among different groups in different research settings. So that's what we're tangling with right now. The other aspect of our survey was to correlate the prevalence of obesity with physical activity. And in these figures here, this is body mass categories defined using BMI measurements or waist circumference measurements. Depending on which metric you use, you're going to get two different measurements. So, waist circumference is a completely different metric for assessing body mass categories. What's unique about this data is that this is the first time that somebody's actually taken this approach and looked at these relationships using both metrics. That is, body mass categories calculated using BMI or waist circumference. So what we see is that with respect to physical activity in males, the top figure here, we can see that, first of all, Hispanic males participate in physical activity to a lesser extent than their non-Hispanic white cohorts. And that obese males participate even less than their normal weight cohort. So while these changes don't seem very impactful, they do suggest that at least in Hispanics, where we see that obese Hispanics, regardless of gender, have a lower total physical activity level, it does suggest that at least this variable has some impact on their body mass category. When we looked at screen behaviors, there wasn't a whole lot that popped out to us. This is interactive and passive screen behaviors, and we tried our best to differentiate the two, but in the end, it doesn't matter. The idea is that for the most part, screen behaviors don't have a very big impact on body mass category. When we do odds ratio analysis, that would confirm that. I don't want to show that because those are messy tables, but the idea is that for the most part, physical activity or screen behaviors are not the primary culprit here. If anything, it's total physical activity. But is inactivity really the culprit? I bring this up because Brad Metcalf in the UK has just recently published some pretty interesting data where he shows that there's not it's not the relationship you would expect between physical inactivity or inactivity and body mass. In fact, what he's shown is that inactivity is actually the result of obesity and not the cause of obesity. In his paper, he suggests that there's a greater psychological and social impact on obesity, at least in the population of adolescent kids in England that they used in the study, than has previously been reported. And so issues like obese kids not wanting to participate because they feel athletically inferior, or they just succumb to more illnesses and injuries, and therefore that impairs their ability to participate and so forth. And so it opened up a whole new can of worms for us, because we had no way. This was published after our first paper came out and after we had already done our survey, and so we couldn't assess this. But this is a very interesting angle to take that I think we're in our hopefully follow-up studies we can properly address with our population, because we've always blamed inactivity as the cause of obesity. But the alternative perspective has to be recognized and respected, because this would suggest that there's a greater psychological or social impact on what's happening beyond just mass balance equations. So some future directions, some ideas for future directions that we want to pursue that I think have some validity based on what we see in the literature are multiple-fold, and here's one idea. This idea of whether obesity is contagious. Valerie Burke in Australia and her colleagues performed this huge study of Australian participants, and what they show is that the prevalence or the increase in BMI is greatest in those participants that had at least, or had two parents that were obese, versus those participants who had either one or none. Okay, and the slope of these these lines here are very telling. And unfortunately, in her paper, she doesn't talk about the slope of these relationships here, but they're very suggestive. It suggests that for individuals that have no parents that are obese, they follow this normal trend, okay, very linear, normal trend, okay. But with individuals that have two parents that are obese, there's a biphasic modality here, and I think this was lost in her discussion, and it's unfortunate because it's very interesting, and it suggests that at least up until the 15 years of age, there's this very steep slope here in this figure, in this relationship, which suggests that the impact of having two obese parents on children and young adolescents is much more severe than it is after these adolescents begin to go into young adulthood. Okay. It almost gives the idea that when adolescents are being raised in a household with two obese parents, they're almost at the will or at the mercy of their parents. And whether there's behavioral impacts or a genetic impact, whatever it is, it seems to be impacting them at a greater stage, especially during these formative years. But once they reach young adulthood and can start making their own decisions, then that slope levels off a little bit and it's not as impactful. I think this is an area that's ripe for further investigation. Another area I think that would be ripe is following up what David Freeman and his colleagues in Mississippi did and Louisiana did with the Bogalusa heart study. This is one of the first studies to target a specific population of children and adolescents, and they assessed the relationship between body mass and systolic blood pressure and other cardiovascular risk markers. Some of the critical findings, they showed that 58% of overweight children had at least one cardiovascular risk factor. The use of overweight as a phenotype could be used as a screening tool to identify about 50% of children that have 2 or more cardiovascular risk factors. That would be an outstanding screening tool if we could translate that for any group of individuals. But understand, the Bogalusa heart study targeted primarily African Americans. This was a study done in Bogalusa, Louisiana, which was primarily African American. And we don't know if these findings translate into any community. But that would be ideal. If we could identify an individual simply based on their body mass category and start preventative measures to abate any onset of cardiovascular complications later on. That would be a huge advantage for physicians in the community, in any community. Another area, and this is more along the lines of my current research with the rats and elephant seals, is the looking at the effect of development of insulin resistance and the manifestation of obesity. Joyce Lee and her colleagues produced this really nice set of data, and they show that obese adolescents have a much greater prevalence of elevated HOMA-IR. HOMA-IR is the homeostatic model for assessing insulin resistance. It's simply a correlation, or not a correlation, it's simply a ratio of fasting insulin to fasting blood glucose levels, so it can be calculated very easily, can be ascertained very easily. And so this data would suggest that, clearly obese adolescents have a higher prevalence for developing insulin resistance. But what they found, a very important finding, was that there's no other factor beyond body mass, in this case obesity, that was as impactful as defining the HOMA-IR status, which suggests that issues like age, sex, ethnicity, race really don't play that critical of a role in the development of insulin resistance as does just adiposity by itself. Along the same lines, this group, Martha Cruz and her group at USC, did a similar study looking specifically at Latino adolescents at USC. And what they found is the prevalence of the adult metabolic syndrome variables are very prevalent in overweight and obese individuals. Over here, this is the insulin sensitivity index, and she shows that in adolescents with a greater number of metabolic syndrome variables that present have reduced insulin sensitivity. The reciprocal of this is they have increased insulin resistance or propensity to develop increased insulin resistance. Again, this was done in Latino adolescents, but they're relatively young. Another aspect of the study that's difficult to reconcile is the Tanner score. The Tanner score is used to assess the stage of puberty in adolescents and children. And you can see the females had a much higher Tanner score than the males. So, and they're all clumped into this data set, so it's not differentiated by gender. And it's hard to do that when you have such disparate Tanner scores, because we know that reproductive status can have an impact on insulin signaling. So that would be interesting to follow up with this. The other thing too is that there's no defined metric for metabolic syndrome in youth or adolescents. The metabolic syndrome is a syndrome that was defined specifically for adults, and this recent review by Harrell points out that we don't have the same definition of metabolic syndrome that can be applied to youths or adolescents. I guess I should define what metabolic syndrome is. The metabolic syndrome is the identification of 3 of the 5 variables defined here: increased central adiposity, reduced LDL, elevated triglycerides, elevated blood pressure, or impaired glucose tolerance, or elevated fasting blood glucose. So there's 5 factors here, and when 3 of these 5 factors are present in the same individual, then they're diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. But as I mentioned, we don't know if that same metric can be applied to adolescents. The only way we will be able to develop that definition for adolescents is to produce more data in adolescents. And then lastly, the idea of interventions. There was a recent review that just, well, it's recent, it just came out. But there's a recent review published that criticizes the use of interventions to address adolescent obesity and metabolic disorders in children and adolescents. And the biggest reason why this criticism came about is over the last 10 or 15 years in which intervention studies have been applied, none of them have been successful at producing robust changes in body mass. And when we're talking about obesity, the primary end variable here that you're trying to measure is body mass, adiposity. And so to date, very few intervention studies have actually been successful. And the idea here is that, when you weigh 200 pounds and you're 12 years old, clearly that's not good. But a 5% decrease only gets you down to 190. And so it's still no different. Most intervention studies that target body mass as an outcome, as the primary outcome, haven't produced anything greater than about 5 to 8% change in body mass. And again, we're talking about usually morbidly obese individuals, and that degree of reduction isn't sufficient enough. What needs to get targeted or these preferred outcome would be somewhere in the 25 to 30 range. And 5 to 8% just isn't considered successful intervention. But in some cases, they do work. And in this case, here's a study where they show that intervention resulted in a significant decrease in raw BMI score. While this value doesn't seem very impactful, keep in mind that this value is a ratio of mass to height. And so small changes in this value actually can define relatively large changes in body mass, especially if the individual is tall. Nonetheless, what they show is that these nutritional and activity interventions, physical activity interventions, produce a decrease in BMI score as well as a HOMA-IR score. And what's really striking here is that within 6 months, they're able to produce a significant improvement in these two critical measures. And for the most part, that the change achieved, or the benefit achieved at 6 months, is consistent for another 24 months, which suggests that in a relatively short period of time, you can achieve maximum success, and that this change can be maintained for a relatively long period of time. So with that in mind, we're not done just because we've got these 2 papers published and a couple of more coming out. We're far from done. We've got a large NIH grant submitted, hopefully, to continue these studies and follow up with what we've already produced. But one of our big goals is to try to emulate the Bogalusa heart study here. Maybe we'll call it the Merced heart study, I don't know. But the idea is to try to replicate that and focus on a number of cardiovascular risk factors beyond what was published by Friedman and his group, with a particular focus on metabolic profiles or metabolomic profiles. Also develop some studies that have covariate analysis that include insulin resistance, systolic blood pressure, and fat mass measurements done specifically by DEXA to better assess what the relationship among these variables is. And then to look at physical activity and nutritional interventions similar to what was shown in the previous study, and using metabolomic and endocrine profiles as well as HOMA-IR, DEXA, and other cardiovascular risk factors as the major outcomes to see if with these interventions we can find some benefit in not just adiposity or body mass, but some other physiological measurements that can be used as risk factors in cardiovascular health. So with that, I appreciate your attention, especially since it's the first Thursday of football and it's so late, but thanks again for the invitation. So I'll be happy to take any questions. Yes?
So Dr. Ortiz, it looks like on one of your slides that for females in the Merced population, there wasn't necessarily a linear correlation with obesity and blood pressure, but it almost looks like there was a tipping point where there was a certain body mass index, and then all of a sudden it seemed to just hit with high blood pressure issues.
What? Was this figure?
Before that, yeah, maybe it was the, go forward a little bit by 2 slides. This one? Yeah, that's the one. So we're looking at A and then C and D, and I'm kind of wondering, there was 2 questions, was what was the average weight and what's the deviations between the lowest and highest considered for obesity? Because you can have somebody 800 pounds versus 300. And there's a huge difference with metabolically what's happening. And I guess I'm wondering if that is somehow you have those numbers. And then I guess I'm looking at A as a population, and it almost looks like, well, versus females in this cohort apparently look like they're tipping versus the linear correlation when you go to the previous slide with males. It looks much more like a direct linear
right
correlation,
here.
absolutely.
Right.
All the way down the line except for African Americans. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and I just don't know if that's kind of what happens maybe. But at the same time, then the second question would be, what were your standard deviations in the weight, and being able to elucidate some of that data out of there. And then the third question would be is whether or not socioeconomic factors were somehow looked at as part of this study too, besides just ethnicity, because sometimes you have other issues based on that.
Okay, so I'll start with the simple question. We didn't assess SES. We didn't have that in our survey. So that's definitely something that we put in to the grant, but we didn't assess it in this round. So it's unfortunate, but absolutely there's some data that suggests that there's very strong SES factors. And so Nancy Butte actually in her Viva la Familia study addresses a lot of that. So she did a nice job there. Now the more difficult question with respect to how this kind of seems to be leveled and then it just drops off. So we do have, so the simple question is that these standard deviations were actually very tight because these groups are stratified, and in this case based on body mass. And so these are all BMI scores that are define obesity. And so we didn't have anybody that was 800. So there wasn't a very large range in body mass within each of these stratified groups. So the standard deviations within the groups are actually pretty small. That's because they're categorized.
Well, I would say they would definitely be categorized for normal and overweight, but then obese, could have such a huge range. That's what I was curious about.
Right, so we didn't have, and so there's actually not a CDC definition for morbid obesity like you have with adults. They just define anything greater than 95 percentile for age and race. I mean age and gender. So that's essentially where we're at with those definitions. We're just using the CDC definitions. But there wasn't a big discrepancy. I mean, not a range like what you mentioned there. Nothing along those lines. So the variation was restricted in that regard. And so actually these numbers inside here are the average systolic blood pressure values for that group. And the reason why I put them in the places that they are in, especially like for example in this group, this value of 123, this mean value, actually defines a pre-elevated blood pressure, which is the gray shaded area. So you can see that for the most part, this increased prevalence of systolic blood pressure in this group caused the blood pressure to go up enough that now it was in, the mean value is now in the pre-elevated range. To give you a better appreciation of that, when we look at this figure, for example, you can see that the mean blood pressure, systolic blood pressure for obese Asian Americans, the increase goes up because the increased prevalence here is impactful enough that the value now goes from being in the pre-elevated range in overweight individuals into the elevated range in obese individuals. So this is suggesting that this increased prevalence is impactful enough to cause the mean value to go into a different category altogether. So, Pam, did that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Great talk, Rudy. Scary talk, but great talk. So you're trying to get, because you're looking at television viewing and trying to get and physical activity, trying to get at the mechanism of obesity and the distribution of obesity and hypertension. But with mixed results, how important is it for you to really understand the basis for these trends that you're seeing? Really understand the mechanism, like genetic basis and behavioral basis and economic basis. Is that really your ultimate goal, is to really know what's causing these trends, or just to find trends and then try to find interventions for these trends, or is mechanism really important?
So, no, absolutely. I think mechanism is very important. This isn't a fishing expedition. We're just not casting a net and seeing what we get and trying to explain it that way. They're targeted measurements with the idea that we can assess the changes in body mass based on the measurements that we're making. And so, ideally, and we can assess the genetic aspects, looking at inheritability scores and so forth. And Nancy did a wonderful job in her Viva la Familia study with that, where she's got some very elaborate inheritability scores, a really nice table looking at all of these factors. But on a molecular basis, it would be nice to be able to do some genomic screening to see where, which genes are changing in these individuals that can give us an idea of what the metabolic changes are that ultimately lead to obesity. Obesity is actually very simply defined. Forget the CDC definitions, but the manifestation of the condition is simple. Simple mass balance equation. Intake of calories is greater than output of calories. There's no surprise there. That's not rocket science. Very simple. It's as simple as I could put it. But what's causing that disparity in caloric intake versus caloric output? That one study by Brad Metcalf and his group in London, which showed that inactivity is the cause of, or obesity is the cause of inactivity as opposed to the result of inactivity. That suggests there's some psychological or social influences that we haven't accounted for. That I'd love to be able to look at that, but overall, I think it's a little bit of everything. The environment, nutrition, there's probably some genetics associated with that. Behaviors, absolutely. I think a lot of it is behavioral. How many of us, let's be honest, how many of us can't wait till I stop talking so we can get in our cars and run to McDonald's? Let's be honest. Yeah, all right. So the rest of you are liars. So, it's just behavior. We run out of here and go grab something to eat.
I mean, is it more important to design interventions, or is it more important to understand mechanisms, do you think, at this point?
I don't know that you can understand the interventions. I think what you have to understand is the result of the intervention. Hopefully the intervention helps to elucidate what the mechanism is. What I hope is that, at least at the folks at NIH, is that they don't think of mechanisms strictly in a cellular or molecular level. I hope they can appreciate that the mechanism can be, social, environmental, behavioral, beyond just the, biotic aspects. There's some strong abiotic factors that are influencing a lot of this. So, ideally, if we can identify what the mechanisms are, then we can begin to develop interventions that address those specifically. It's just like in pharmaceuticals, in medicine. When we know what the cause of a certain pathology is, then you can develop, either pharmaceutical intervention or behavioral intervention to address the problem. But if you don't know what the problem is or what manifests the problem, then it's hard to incorporate some kind of an intervention. Yeah. Yes, Chris.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for the talk, Rudy. It was enlightening for me as far as the physiological relationships between BMI in adolescence and blood pressure, etc. And also to thank you for the sugar-sweetened beverages. So
I was up all night cooking cookies for you guys.
But I mean, doesn't this suggest where we're at if we're talking about real change and real intervention when professors with PhDs they make a choice and it's sugar-sweetened beverages and cookies for an educated audience? And I know that's a rhetorical question, but moving on to something else, as far as intervention, I've been doing a little research on interventions for adolescents in the stage 3 and stage 4 interventions, according to the expert panel. I mean, most of those show success, but it's twice a week for the adolescent to go in over the course of a year. And is that feasible for the prevalence that we have these days?
No, and you know, God, I wish I remember who wrote that recent review. You may know. Jan left. Hey, Jan left. Slacker. But you probably, do you know which review I'm talking about? It was a whole review on you know, why interventions or successive interventions, and they mentioned that the whole issue of feasibility and maintenance. You know, that most of these adolescents, especially the targeted groups, they're young children, you know, 12, 13, 14 years old, going into that early adolescent phase, where their transportation is completely dependent on somebody else. And so it's not very easy for them to continue participation in these programs because it's not very useful. Now, you know, it's hard to compare those studies with the Pennington studies because, as you may well know, Pennington provides everything. They, you know, for their severely obese individuals, they come into the center and they stay there. And they're there for, you know, 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is, they're there. They don't have to go anywhere. And you know, for their other studies, they go out. They have a little shuttle, you know, it says Pennington Research Institute. They go out, they pick people up and bring them back to the center. So, you know, that's ideal. You know, I love it how a Pennington type center here. But you know, where is the money for something like that can cover? That's hard to establish and go forth. But the idea is that I think a lot of the failure in those interventions is just that, is maintaining participation in those interventions. And some of those interventions just don't seem to be very realistic. Like you said, 2, 3, 4 weeks or times a week even is pretty difficult. You know, and there's other factors, of course, that I'm not bringing up that are associated with that. But
you know, I question whether it's money well spent, considering that the dietary and physical activity habits are well established by kindergarten.
yeah.
So if we're looking at the 15-year-old who comes out of Merced High and they navigate 30-something fast food restaurants just to get out of the 2-block area.
That's right. Yeah, it's hard to overcome that. Yeah, that's a big problem. So, you know, we've actually proposed to just do a very basic study between Golden Valley and Merced for that exact reason, to see if we can assess what the impact of all of those fast food restaurants in that area is on BMI, because you don't see that at Golden Valley or Buhack Colony or something like that. So that's a really good point. But you know, it's not just our community. There's other communities which that's the case. But yeah, I don't think there's a simple answer. I mean, if there was a simple answer, I wouldn't be standing. Yes, sir.
For the general public, do you have any recommendations as how to address the Merced High School obesity problem?
Did I say there was a problem?
Or the obesity?
So, I don't, recommendations. Let me back up and quantify this a little bit. Yeah, the prevalence rates that we identified in terms of overweight and obesity are the highest reported in the literature for any community. Is that a problem? I think that's probably a problem. I don't want to, don't quote me. To me, my personal perspective is, to me, that's a problem. But I didn't say that in my talk. That's just, off the record, my perspective. Now, the recommendations, there's a whole host of things that can be done, but I really don't know what's causing this. So it's a shot in the dark. The simplest recommendation is to eat healthy and to exercise. I mean, I could give that recommendation to anybody. So, but I don't know that I don't know exactly what the variables are that are impacting. And it's not just Merced High. Remember, this survey was done of the 5 high schools in the area. So it was Merced, UHAC, Atwater, Golden Valley, and Livingston. And so we didn't discriminate based on the location of the high schools, or look at any high school effect. Although that would have been ideal, but so I can't say that it's just Merced High School. It's the high schools in the county that's the issue. But the recommendation is eat healthy and exercise a lot, or at least balance your caloric intake with their output. Any other questions? I think Trevor's giving me the sign that we got to run a McDonald's. So. Yeah. Well, thanks again for your.